Good evening. Hopefully this is coming through. I always like to give a few minutes to make sure that my microphone's actually working and I'm not having any boomer technical difficulties. As I've been kind of trying to get better at these live streams, I thought maybe I'd have some kind of musical intro or something, but I'm never confident enough for my setup. I always have to set these things up from scratch, so people just have to tell me whether they can actually hear me. So I'm kind of counting on the chat now to tell me that they can actually hear what I'm saying and they can see me coming through. Yeah, it's kind of been a hectic day. I know I'm supposed to give a little spiel. I have like prepared talks on these things usually. I'm not really prepared, but just some notes to work off of. But my preparation for this live stream was kind of cut short, largely due to the fact that my wife's bearded dragon, which had escaped about 2 months ago, was finally recovered, and I had spent most of the afternoon trying to build from scratch a giant hutch for this lizard. So I've been kind of finishing up that project and just kind of coming back from it. But anyway, yes, getting back into the saddle. So this week, or I guess this month really, a lot of stuff has happened, and I guess this is always the question with these distance live streams, is what I'm actually going to use them for. At this point, I wanted to talk about a few things. Obviously, I released a video series that I kind of wanted to elaborate on, and a lot of people, when I did a little poll, also wanted me to talk about propertarianism. So I'm going to talk a little about that after the stream kind of normalizes. People are pressing F in the chat for the bearded dragon. The bearded dragon was actually recovered, which is why I spent the lion's share of this afternoon building a hutch for it in 100-degree temperatures. So that I'm not worried about. We are united with our lost bearded dragon, and my wife is very happy about that fact. And but speaking of other prodigal people, we are going to be talking about propertarianism and Kurt Doolittle before I get to the first round of super chats. So I think that will sort of kick this live stream off. It is a good talk about propertarianism. Now, I'm really late to the party at this stage. A lot of people have done videos on propertarianism. Most notably is Keith Woods, who's a person I've had some disagreements with, but he has been doing some really amazing videos recently, in my personal opinion. And one of the really amazing videos he released this month, because it was a while ago now, but it's recent in my mind since it was one of the more recent videos I actually saw. I kind of have to be more selective about the stuff that I actually watch these days, just to constrain the time. But he did an amazing takedown of what's happened to propertarianism. This was supposed to be, at least in 2018, it was supposed to be the new up-and-coming movement on the right. And I think in early 2019, I did a video highly critical of propertarianism. And this kicked off a huge online spur gout on the part of propertarianism's founder, Kurt Doolittle. Kurt Doolittle is his name, and he's in the thumbnail of this stream, to the point where Kurt actually attempted to get my docs so he could subpoena me for a libel suit, which never happened. I never actually got a summons, or I was never actually served a summons for this libel suit, so it was a complete bluff. But this is sort of the kind of person that was organizing this thing, and it was strange because I think in 2018, there was the emergence of this YouTuber, John Mark. He was kind of notable because he always used to wear these red motorcycle helmets, and he had this very, very produced techno music background, which I kind of liked. It was a little repetitive, but it kind of had this early 2000s house feel to it, and you know, it was highly produced. And John Mark meteorically rose to prominence overnight. He got I think he got 500,000 views, and he went from being an unknown YouTuber to having more subscribers than I ever had. And of course, he attracted an immediate attention. And this brought to the forefront this philosophy of propertarianism, which through its founder, Kurt Doolittle, had been a thing. It had been around the right wing for quite a long time. And you always used to run into random people who were really into propertarianism, and they'd talk your ear off about propertarianism. And of course, if you went on Facebook, not that I use Facebook anymore, not that I even used Facebook in 2018, but if you were in right-wing circles in 2018, the propertarian memes were all over the place because they were making a big push. And now, apparently, this month, July of 2020, propertarianism has completely imploded, and we're going to go over the story of that and also discuss some of the problems with this philosophy, the ones that I went over in my original video, and also perhaps some new ones that have become apparent in the wake of this movement's total and utter collapse. Now, as you might have suspected from me retelling the story of my interactions with Kurt Doolittle in 2019, these people aren't the most emotionally stable people who were involved in this movement. Just for instance, John Mark himself, I always remembered him and was always kind of funny about him, was that he used a style of talking that would immediately turn off anyone from a blue state or from an educated background in a blue state. It was the kind of dialogue you might encounter in a hard sell situation, a car dealership, some kind of door-to-door salesman, or I know this is a stereotype, but some kind of door-to-door preacher like a Mormon, someone who's really trying to sell you on this new ideology. So he'd say things like, "You can't find a better ideology than propertarianism. I have a Harvard-level IQ, and folks, I haven't seen anything like this." This is language that I guess appeals to a certain kind of person. It certainly sounds like the person went to marketing school or something of that kind. He was trained to talk like this, either in a professional capacity. But again, anyone who comes from a blue state or who's gone through graduate school at least, or sort of well acquainted with academic or urban circles, this will immediately turn them off. No one from Harvard says that they have a Harvard level IQ. But this is how John Mark talked, and Kurt Doolittle also had this sort of hard sell. I have the solution. I'm the smartest guy in the room. Constantly explicitly bragging about his own intelligence. And, as somebody, this is always a big red flag for somebody who comes from an academic background. Most people who have products that sell like this, they brag, but they don't brag quite in this way. And so, immediately it kind of engaged my interest, and this is what kind of kicked off the initial investigation I did in 2019. And I'm going to go over to my substantive critique of propertarianism, but what I found, though, sort of very prominently when I looked on Kurt Doolittle's website, propertarianism.org, was it had been established for 4 years. You could go to the DNS databases and see that it was not a new website, but it was supposedly selling complete educations in propertarianism. You could literally pay money and buy classes in propertarian ideas, and every single one of these classes was taught by Kurt Doolittle. Okay, first red so first red flag. You had to pay for them. Some of them were free, but you had to pay for them. And that's not the worst part. The worst part was that the entire website was just full of lorem ipsum, lorem ipsum. So lorem ipsum is this Latin text. I think it comes from Cicero. I forget what it actually means, but essentially it's typesetting filler. So when people are typesetting a book and they're trying to get the paragraph spacing right and the line spacing right, they just continuously write lorem ipsum and whatever follows it again and again and again to make it seem like it's complete, so they can get an idea of what the finished copy of the book or a manuscript will look like. And this was a good 70% of the website was filler text, something that you'd see on a beta version. And all the pictures of the employees that work for propertarianism.org were stock photos. They were taken from stock employee databases. You could do Google searches on the images, and they came up in stock databases. And so the entire thing just looked completely like a scam. And this is something that, an earlier blogger who had gotten in contact with me, and I think I recently had a conversation with him on something else. His name was Ereval. He kind of blew the whistle on Kurt Doolittle much earlier than I did. And he had pointed out that this indeed was something that he felt either was a scam or was the fact that Kurt Doolittle was actually working for some kind of federal agency. And this was a huge sting operation. And, I'm actually quite skeptical of these claims that people are operatives trying to bring down right-wingers. I think that it leads to sort of it leads to paranoia, obviously, and it doesn't really get anywhere, right? It doesn't get anywhere. And everyone I know on the right has been accused of being a Fed. I've been accused of being a Fed. You name it. Millennial Woes has been accused of being a Fed. Mark Collette's been accused of being a Fed. I'm sure Nick Fuentes has, although you get these insults, they're just tossed around. So of course I took this with a big grain of salt. But the problem with this is that you blew on this ideology and it just seemed to kind of come unraveled. I know Keith Woods brought this up and this is news to me, but the meteoric rise of John Mark now in hindsight looks totally artificial. The guy released a video and instantaneously got 500,000 views. He somehow had access to what looked like a professional editing team. And and he went from having no web presence to having, being one of the largest right-wing channels on the entire dissident right. And this is really from being part of a movement that had a very, very poor reputation in online circles before that. And this is nothing that Keith Woods pointed out, and I'd heard this, but Kurt Doolittle is some kind of strange CEO of a company that no one's ever heard of in Ukraine, and he's an American. And he looks like he has a history working for the federal government. So if you know the operations of agencies, you'll know that they have a very large presence in Ukraine and other areas that border Russia, because they believe there's a strategic interest in destabilizing Russian interests in those countries. So I do agree that this looked bad. There's the question of whether Kurt Doolittle is a Fed. However, I think this is sort of the least interesting thing about Kurt Doolittle and propertarianism. And when I did my video takedown on propertarianism, or my video critique, I shouldn't use the word takedown. That sounds kind of infantile. I was trying to emphasize something a little bit different. And this is sort of what I want to talk about now. Now, obviously, the event that facilitated the end of propertarianism was this event that Kurt Doolittle did in Richmond, I think it's Richmond, Virginia, on July the 4th. And he was saying, and John Mark was echoing this, that this was Reformation Day, that they were going to reform America by introducing a new constitution or a new modification on the Constitution. And this was one of the big criticisms I had when I originally did my video on propertarianism in 2019. The biggest problem was that Kurt Doolittle had an entire ideology that he claimed to have written, but he hadn't actually written anything other than a variety of Twitter and Facebook posts. His ideology was entirely comprised in a set of rambling Facebook posts that were at radical odds with each other tonally, but seemed to always invoke some kind of callback to the founding fathers, to a new constitution. But there was no book on propertarianism. There was no white paper on propertarianism. there were no outside of what John Mark had produced, which was, I mean, to be perfectly blunt, these really, really low IQ hard sells of propertarianism. There was no really reference material for this ideology. And so, Kurt Doolittle was trying to sell this product, propertarianism, and he was constantly saying he had this idea, but it was impossible to track it down. It was consistently just this elusive thing. And whenever you ask somebody who was involved in this effort, this propertarianist movement, they'd always point to this upcoming constitution that Kurt Doolittle was writing. It's always a big red flag. So Kurt Doolittle was, as opposed to writing a book of philosophy or a white paper about an idea, he was going straight from an idea of propertarianism straight to a constitution built on propertarianism. And this was going to rewrite all our notions of liberty and justice and order and law. And it was going to solve, he was claiming it was going to solve the Enlightenment. That was his big selling point. And I'm sure people are cringing in the chat right now. And this is something that obviously, I mean, there are huge problems with. So this event in Richmond, I guess, I hadn't looked at the philosophy for quite some time. Apparently the Constitution had been written, and Kurt Doolittle was ready to release this and give this to a general audience. And he and this large crowd of kind of clueless-looking people got up on the Capitol steps and started reciting this incredibly cringy speech where Kurt Doolittle, dressed in khaki shorts and this shirt and this beige hat, were just yelling into the microphone like quotes from Shakespeare and from Braveheart, as if you were about to storm the Capitol and kick off the next American Revolution. And if that's not bad enough, after each thing he says in this very, very high-pitched voice he has, is friends, Romans, countrymen, and everyone's yelling reciprocality, or whatever they say. That's their buzzword that they always yell. The buzzword of propertarianism is reciprocality, reciprocation. That's supposed to be the foundation of propertarian law. And after all this is passed and he puts down his megaphone, these two guys from Black Lives Matter approach Kurt, and for some reason the camera is still rolling on this guy. The camera is still rolling on Kurt, who's just completely wetted down in a few different areas, according to Kurt, because of the heat, but he does not look like he's in good shape. And these young black guys come in and they start lecturing him on about how they're not so different from him and they're all fighting the same struggle. And as soon as Kurt Doolittle encounters these BLM people, he immediately starts flattering them. He immediately starts flattering them, telling them how great they are, in a few other respects that I can't repeat in a family-friendly YouTube channel. And then, 5 minutes after he engages with these people, in a philosophy that's all about not giving up your platform without reciprocation, Kurt Doolittle hands over the microphone, and the whole thing turns into a Black Lives Matter rally, where the BLM activists literally preach from his pulpit their ideas. And Kurt Doolittle, if you can see it in this photo here, he's raising his fist up with him. To be quite honest, this was not very good optics. Kurt had not a very good optical moment there. And I have to take care of something very quickly. I'll be right back. People, just give me a second here. All right. All right. Sorry about that, guys. Baby crying. Had to go check. So, yes, I apologize. So, in the middle of this thing, he essentially surrenders his own platform, gives it up to Black Lives Matter, and they give a speech about how they're the same struggle and everyone should be marching for Black Lives Matter. And then all of the propertarian guys raise their fist and go, reciprocation. And again, this is not good optics, Kurt. You start off quoting Julius Caesar and Richard V, and you sound like you're going to storm Washington. The next moment, you're giving your platform up to progressives and Black Lives Matter. If we needed another institution to surrender to Black Lives Matter, I don't think we'd be looking to the distant right. And so this was terrible optics, to put it mildly. But what was so surprising, again, and I know Keith Woods did mention this, what was so surprising is that the very next day after this video was released on John Mark's channel, John Mark, who had a monetized channel with, I think it was some 100,000 subscribers, an enormous audience, an enormous view count. He deletes his entire channel. He deletes his entire Patreon. He destroys the income that would have certainly been enough to live off of. He just disappears, and he releases this statement saying that he no longer believes that propertarianism is the way, that he needs to do slow institution building, and everyone who followed propertarianism or was at this rally were the equivalent of McNamara's idiots. We can't fight a civil war with McNamara's idiots. And this was always John Mark's thing. John Mark and Kurt Doolittle's thing, and this was another common criticism of the whole affair. Their whole angle was that the only way to resolve the culture war was direct and locked civil war against the federal government. And everyone pointed out to them how stupid this was. Everyone pointed out to them how glowy this was. But they persisted. They persisted in making these claims. And John Mark, strangely enough, while everyone else was getting banned, was able to make video after video after video, essentially cheerleading for this eventuality. Cheerleading ahead of a second American Civil War. And then a day after this embarrassing thing happened with Kurt Doolittle, he immediately disappears. A day after all of the propertarians dox themselves at Richmond, he immediately disappears. And that's it. That seems to be the end of the movement. And of course, Kurt Doolittle's on rants now on Facebook and on Twitter, and has been for the last half month. Again, blaming this on the followers, which is always the last refuge of a failed leader, is to blame your own faults on your followers. Now, obviously, people have put together the things that I've said here, and if you want a good video that puts this together in starker relief, again, I'd recommend the Keith Woods video. But people have put two and two together, and the explanation that's becoming the most favorable on the right is that this was a big Fed operation. That this was Kurt Doolittle was essentially an employee of the federal government, and John Mark and the people surrounding his immediate leadership circle were trying to get people to self-dox themselves in anticipation of trying to head off violent right-wing activism, such that highly violent and perhaps highly autistic people would be attracted to this movement and would essentially dox themselves at this Richmond event, which was an enormous fiasco. Not that I think it was very well attended to begin with. I mean, it was a very small crowd of people. I know COVID is a thing, but I mean, it was not very impressive. And again, this is the lesson that I think the right wing has taken for propertarianism. The problem is I don't really think this is the right lesson to take. And I'm going to go into why. I mean, Kerr Doolittle was a Fed or wasn't. That's the big question. I'm not so sure how much it really matters. There are just a number of mistakes that are made in this whole endeavor, and I'm going to try to talk a little bit about them before I go on here. So propertarianism, in my original video, what I really kind of got after it for was the ideology, and this is something that Kerr Doolittle embodied, was a particular form of what I called ghost dancing. Now, ghost dancing, or the ghost dances, were a series of rituals performed by the Western Indian tribes, in particular the Sioux. They after their large losses against the United States cavalry, they began engaging in this ritual called ghost dancing, in which they practiced the religious rituals of their ancestors harder and better, and this was supposed to summon forward the spirits of their ancestors so that they could reclaim the lands that had been taken from them from the numerically and militaristically superior federal government and essentially Anglo-European United States governments at the time, which is obviously never going to happen. And the difficulty with Kerr Doolittle, and we can ignore all of the sort of autism and the boomerish nature of propertarianism. We can ignore the eccentricities of Kerr Doolittle and his cringe-like speech skills and his cringe optic sense, and we could start looking at the problem with propertarianism is not that it's uniquely bad. It is uniquely bad. The problem with propertarianism is that it has problems that are more extensive to the right generally. And one of them is ghost dancing. And this is the refusal to let go of things that are from an earlier era and to try to double down on things that worked, not so much because you think that they'll work again, but because you want them to work. This is what you've been raised with, right? And so if you look at propertarian memes, and I have one here, I don't know if this is a joke or if this is a genuine propertarian meme, but trust me when I say that the propertarian meme archive was filled to the brim of just these kind of memes. And if you ever listen to a John Mark video before his channel was taken down, every other video was him comparing Kerr Doolittle and himself to the founding fathers. And that's very much how they saw themselves. What's the story that we've been raised with as I'm not an Anglo-American, but as indigenous European Americans in America? It's the story of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, which was like the just war of origin, and then the emergence of a new country that was built on liberty. And this is obviously what they're trying to harken back to. But none of these, for people who are at all skeptical of the history of the revolution, none of this pertains to our own age. It's what I would call ghost dancing. The reason why they're invoking the Constitution and the reason why they're invoking the Revolutionary War is because it's what we're raised with. It's what we're expecting to see. And so no one asks the question, who is the audience for this Constitution? How was the American Revolution won? Why was it won? And if you ask and answer all of these questions, you'll see that the specific circumstances historically that gave birth to this moment, the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the emergence of this republic, it had really nothing to do. It had to do with a very specific set of circumstances that really don't pertain at all to our present era. And some circumstances are absolutely different. And so the reason why this is invoked is again, to be comfortable. It's to get people on board with an easy solution and then pretend like we can just digress the entire conversation onto how great Kerr Doolittle's Constitution is, if it is indeed that great. Largely, it's a pile of language where Kerr Doolittle thinks that he has the ability to essentially solve politics, as Keith Woods puts it. And that's essentially what he's trying to do. He's trying to create a system of language that is so perfect that it will save people from themselves. It will demand that they be heroic, and it will demand that they be, well, right-wing and moral, without any moral impetus, without any invocation of some larger spiritual purpose, without any appeal to teleology, or without any appeal to religion for that matter. And this is something that the Founding Fathers themselves thought was impossible, and it's certainly impossible now that when Kurt Doolittle tried to do it. He was totally unclear, even in his rambling Facebook pages, about how he would answer very, very simple questions. He essentially wanted to illegalize lying. That was the trick of this new constitution. And of course, it fell flat on its face. He couldn't tell me succinctly whether he would, as an atheist, ban Christianity, for instance. And so you have to ask yourself, why would a group of right-wingers want to follow this insane constitution that couldn't answer these very, very basic questions? And it's because, again, it's a ghost dance. It's a comfortable mode. People are looking for something like this. It's hard to think outside of the things we've been raised with. And because of that, it's sorry, I got distracted by the chat. And because of this, it sells, right? People want to believe this, right? People want to believe this. And this is, I guess, my point in the talk in this live stream right now, and what I'll try to get back into later after I start answering super chats. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, in my opinion, whether Kurt Doolittle was a Fed or not. Because even before Kurt Doolittle, this was the mode of the right wing. I can't tell you how many right-wingers I've talked to online that they do just this. They're like, let me tell you, buddy, like, it's go time. It's go time. They have no idea how powerful Red America is. Like, we're just gonna unleash hell on them, and we're gonna make 1776 the answer to 2020. I mean, it's even a meme by Alex Jones. But this stuff is a consistent feature of the right, which is this persistent Fed posting. And so even if you convinced me that John Mark and Kurt Doolittle were federal agents, people do these things even without them. And the only reason why this captured the imagination of so many people was that this kind of dialectic was popular and indeed mandated by people on the right. And so this is sort of my little thesis for tonight. I call this, there's something that I think we can learn from Kurt Doolittle. And that is what I would like to say. Perhaps we can make this Doolittle's law of politics. And this is: a sufficiently high level of autism in a movement's leadership is indistinguishable from a concerted government effort to destroy that movement. And this is the thing. It doesn't. People who are myopically focused on the past, or who have problems thinking critically and outside of the box about systems and about models we have about the universe, they are attracted to what Kurt Doolittle was preaching. A systematized way of constraining human thought in a way that's like mathematics, that calls back to something that's familiar in the past, and that gets around all sorts of messy notions of art and vision of the future and religion and faith and loyalty, and just gets us back to a new constitution, a new old way of doing something, right? And this is the essence of the ghost dance. The essence of the ghost dance is that it's a new old way of doing things. It's supposedly revolutionary. It always calls to a possible revolution or civil war, as John Mark would put it. But it's, at the end of the day, it's just the old model coming back and back and back again. And so I feel in many ways this is where we are. I don't really care if Kurt Doolittle was a Fed or not. I do care very deeply that the right wing can stop repeating his mistakes long after John Mark and Kurt Doolittle have left the scene, long after their careers have ended. And apparently they have ended after this rather embarrassing display at Richmond early in July. So this is something I think I want to sort of engage in this talk is how do we avoid being Kurt Doolittle and without even the paycheck potentially from the feds. This is a recent portrait of Kurt, very sweaty from his very rousing speech he gave at Richmond. So these are sort of the three things that you can see very clearly in propertarianism. They're all over Kurt Doolittle's career, and we on the right, I think, need to stop doing them. This is something that's becoming a problem. The first one, obviously, is Fed posting. I think everyone's talked about this. And there's the obvious stuff. There's the obvious stuff where you talk about doing things that are illegal and that will get you arrested, and your Discord servers banned and your YouTube channels banned on your platforms. But it also it's a more general thing than just Fed posting. The problem is gloating about power you don't have and can't use. So I know that Red America thinks that it has the goods on Blue America, but it doesn't. They talk about the silent majority, but if the silent majority is silent, then it doesn't matter. And if a majority is so afraid that it can't even speak up, I really don't think that they're going to be fighting the kind of battle that John, Mark, and Kurt Doolittle talk about in their former online careers. I'm not saying that Red America and the conservatives and reactionaries in this country are completely disempowered, but every time we get into these conversations, we have to kind of take stock about where the right is in this country, which is not in a privileged position in any way, shape, or form. And gloating about how you have this secret cache of power, at this stage at least, is futile and counterproductive, even if you're doing it in a way that's completely legal. And I know this kind of goes contrary to one of Saul Alinsky's rules for organizing. He says power is not just what you have, but what your enemies think you have. The critical problem with this is that at least since 2012, I would argue certainly, and probably before this, I'd say probably any time after the 90s, Blue America has become increasingly aware of the fact that Red America's bark is much worse than its bite. And at this point, they're calling the bluff every single time. So, it is true that power is what your opponent thinks you have. But at this point, power claimed by right-wingers, the left will always call this bluff. So it's a sure way to lose post-2012 in the culture war or in any war against the progressive establishment, what we might call the cathedral. Okay, so the second thing you don't want to do is, I don't really have a way of putting this term. Again, I like saying autism for number two, but I know that's very unfair to people who suffer from the disability. But it is something that people with this disability or on the spectrum, they do have a proclivity of making this mistake. And that is having a kind of systematized myopia. And this means that, if you're like a computer algorithm, and computer algorithms, they have these tree searches they do all the time. And a bad computer algorithm, and this was one of the first computer algorithms I ever wrote, is that opposed to searching across the tree in a very broad way first, they try to narrowly focus down on one branch. And of course, they miss all these opportunities they could have gotten. And so, but this is something that a lot of people, a certain kind of mind, but even ordinary minds, they do this a lot. They have this system. You've been educated how to see the world a certain way. And the world you've been educated with is rational discourse, guided by Enlightenment principles. And the best example of this is my Constitution, my Declaration of Independence. And so when you see a problem, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and you immediately reach for the nail before you even ask what's going on. And so people, what they do is they double down on the models that they're familiar with, rather than what we should always be doing when we're in when you're in a moment of critical failure, and you're reasonably certain that that it emerges somewhere from the model. You want to question whether your model is accurate before you double down and just go deeper into that model. The easy way is going, okay, let's do exactly what we did before, but do it harder, do it better, do it faster. But that's kind of unimaginative, and it's also just bad engineering. You always, when you have a failure in your system, you don't want to be myopic, and you don't want to build that myopia into your system of doing things. And that's exactly what the Propertarians did with their notion of a constitution. In an era where I think it's manifestly apparent that constitutions don't have any power outside of interpretive bodies' willingness to enforce them and willingness to live up to their core tenets. And so I think this is sort of where we are. We need to get out of this mode of just doubling down, and that's a huge problem. And I think the third thing is, I'll reiterate this. The third problem is ghost dancing. And one of the things I think I'll get into later is how can we look to the past, and this gets sort of to the nostalgia problem, right? How can you look to the past in a way where the past is teaching you something, unless of in a way where the past is actually constraining you, where it's limiting your imagination? The ghost dancing is a problem because your solutions to an emergent problem are being conformed to your comfort levels, and you're not actually exploring the constraints as they actually exist. I think that there was a way for the Western Indian tribes to handle the incursion of the white men much, much better in the late 19th century than what they ultimately did. And I'm not blaming them for this, obviously. I think that, arguably, the indigenous European population of this country might not be handling their displacement any better. But at any rate, we can realize what they did incorrectly. And one of the things that they did incorrectly was that they looked back and they mistook comfort for a solution, and for something that was wholesome, and for something that was nourishing. And I think this was one of the big problems of ghost dancing. And I guess one of the things, and one of the big pitfalls we have with all of these things, with these narratives that are backwards looking, is that they are sort of heroic in a way, right? Ghost dancing was this heroic narrative about how the spirits of your ancestors will rise up in a revolution against the federal government and reclaim your ancestral lands. So there was a heroic dimension to that, and they seemed hard. But they weren't. They were hard in the way of, we're doing it harder. We in the future we will exert more effort. They weren't actually hard in the way of intellect and trying to explore the bounds of a problem that's truly emergent. And so because of this, they weren't very effective. They weren't a very effective way of addressing an issue, and an issue that was besetting these cultures in their time period. So this is sort of the end of my first talk. Maybe I'll give a little bit of spiel about comfiness and about being comfy. I think that was something I wanted to talk about a little bit. Obviously, I'm a little bit more tired than I thought I would be the outside of this live stream. But I think I'm seeing a lot of super chats, so I'll just try to answer them now. Ooh, wow, a lot of super chats. Okay. Okay, so starting from before the stream, thank you very much. Eponymous Archon for $63. Wow, thank you very much for your contribution. There's no questions, so I hope that you'll forgive me for going on and answering other questions, but thank you very much for that very generous contribution. Turner Reves for $2. I have a pirate radio station. Can I use your vids? Absolutely, Turner. Go for it. And this is everything on this channel. I consider to be Creative Commons share with attribution. Now, I don't strictly enforce this. You can use my video clips and not cite me, but I'd prefer it. I'd really ask you if you could cite where you got the clips at some point. That would really help the channel, and I think it's a pretty minimal ask, to be quite honest. But other than that, go nuts. I don't really care who shares around the videos. It's kind of the rule of the internet. It's not anything really unique. But thank you very much for the super chat, and good luck on the pirate radio station. I've always fancied, I should say, that it would be really cool to have a continuously running pirate radio station that played things like classical music or old time music, which is one of my personal passions, and that also had commentary or DJs that would talk about news items from a somewhat reactionary or distant right perspective. I always thought that would be kind of an interesting project. Now, of course, in the era of streaming, I don't know, do people do pirate radio stations anymore? It seems sort of something people did in the 90s or even in the early 2000s. It seemed a few years ago that with the advent of all of these vaporwave channels, that there was a new era of pirate radio coming from people who would continuously stream music with a live stream chat. And this was something that I thought was very promising, but it's not something that I was ever able to get to work. It's a very high bandwidth activity. But anyway, sorry, good luck with the pirate radio station. I'm going to go on. Alex Ashley for $5. Congrats on the cozy vid. It was awesome in the true sense of the word. Well, thank you very much. Other than folk, what are your other cozy hallmarks? Do you like spicy food? I do like spicy food. I think this is something I wanted to talk a little bit about in this live stream, was how to be cozy. And I have to confess, in the wake of being busier this weekend than I thought I would be, and in the wake of doing the propertarianism spiel, I didn't write many notes down on being cozy. Let's talk about some things that maybe I've always wanted to do. I always thought that something that would be a good tradition to engage with again is a Burns dinner. Now, Robert Burns was a famous Scottish English poet who was in the 19th century. He was very famous for writing an enormous number of poems that after his death became ballads for folk music. And I think it's every February or January, people of a literary bent get together and have this huge Scottish dinner in honor of the poet. And there's a very set way of doing things. There are particular courses, and there are particular times for reading. And in between that, you get to have conversations, and it's just a big party. And I've always thought that this would be really, really nice to do. Back in the day when I had sort of a very consistent set of friends and I wasn't constantly moving around everywhere, we always used to have sort of a similar get together for New Year's, where people would sing old songs and generally have a really kind of cozy and with friends New Year's get together. But over the years that's faded away a little bit, and once everyone has kids, it becomes harder and harder and harder to pull off. And I don't even know how. Obviously, with New Year's, these things it's always hard to find babysitters for these days. But I think you might be able to do it better for a Burns night if you ever wanted to. Host one of those things. Well, I certainly wanted to. It's funny that you mentioned spicy food, because the food that's sort of I'm most ethnically attached to is Hungarian food, and that is kind of notoriously spicy. Goulashes and spicy sausages and stuff like that. I guess it's for myself, it's Hungarian food with a sort of German bent on it. But it's I guess I'll talk about this as the video goes on, but at where I'm standing right now, what's coming to my mind is just sort of dinner get-togethers. It's something that's a cozy way to interact with people. That is universal. Food is a universal language. Everyone understands it. And now that you mention it, this has been something that I know I talked to. I can't remember if I remember talking about this on some podcast in which I said that the future of the right is in building bridges to things like the slow food movement. Now, in the 1990s, there was sort of this rebellion against globalization. And a lot of the people who were part of this rebellion were Western European farmers who didn't want to have their products displaced by the global market, but also didn't want to have their food culture displaced by the global market. And so they came up with this idea of slow food, which was sort of focusing on locally grown produce and in eating rituals that are absolutely specific to a time, a people, and a place. And it's so funny, but this dovetails exactly with sort of the right's own complaints about how globally there's this sort of force of global cultural homogenization. Everywhere you go is starting to look more and more and more like California. There are the same restaurants, and there are the same hipster venues, and there are the same movies, and everything is just a copy of a copy of a copy, and it's quite depressing, to be quite honest. It seems to me that just like the hipster, his culture is sort of totally dependent on this gourmand idea where you just sample a new food every day, and you have this is completely displaced. It's all in these urban venues that just are totally disconnected from where this food is grown and where the people who make this food come from. What if there was an alternative way, an alternative food culture on the right that, like the slow food movement of the 1990s and early 2000s, emphasized values in eating and serving food that were diametrically opposed to this? So I know that's my thoughts on the matter. So hopefully that helps. Nerve AMV maker for $20. Once crime was perceived as a sickness to be cured instead of a sin to be punished, progressive reformers slowly started adopting the worldview of criminals. The law now serves to protect criminals from vigilante justice. Yeah, I mean, this is. I don't want to I know this is for $20, so thank you very much for that contribution. I'm always hesitant to bring up interactions I've had with people outside of YouTube, but I know that I think I interacted with you on Twitter when we were talking to progressives about their ideas about punishment and how we should abolish prisons. And this is like the new thing. And if you follow BreadTube channels, which again I have the curse of liking to follow leftists, pardon me for my crimes. And one of the things that the YouTuber Big Joel posted was a defense of Milo Stewart, and of course Milo Stewart's new thing is abolish all prisons, which is not original. You hear lots of leftists talking about this. And you talk to the Twitter progressives on this thing, by replying to this, and you get this idea that no one should ever be punished for anything ever. And this is sort of their line, that any punishment a person suffers, even from restraint, is totally unjust and it is a violation of human rights. And so, but the thing is, you push on this, right? You push on this, and you realize that this is not true, right? Like, they don't want to let all the rapists and murderers out of prison. But the reason that they want, the pretense that they want to restrict these people is they want to restrict these people for the pretense of being sick, right? So they want to send them to hospitals that are secure and locked down and from which they cannot escape, nor which they can get out of even if they want to. So in other words, they want to have hospitals act like prisons for highly violent individuals. And then they want to, they're essentially just renaming hospitals or they're renaming prisons to be hospitals for the criminals. And then you press them on this again, and you realize that their what appears on the surface to be just this overflowing compassion and this unbounded mercy towards misdeed is completely curtailed by the very moment that these ideas go against their ideology. These are the same people that believe that hate speech should be punished criminally. These are the same people that believe reactionary ideas should be punished criminally. These are the same people, I mean, and if you bring it up to the people who actually, the cops that actually shot George Floyd, they have absolutely no mercy for these people. And so the image you get, in when you put all of these pieces together and sort of reconstruct what must, by due course, be the natural consequence of this vision, you get the idea what they want is they want prisons to be renamed hospitals, and they want both murderers, rapists, and then people they disagree with to be declared sick and sent to these hospitals indefinitely until they discard their wrongthink and they can be well integrated into their ideal system. And they're perfectly fine with forced labor as long as you call the forced labor community service, right? So I mean, so we're gonna have forced hospital time and community service, totally not a gulag for thought criminals, rapists, and murderers. Wow, this sounds wonderful. This sounds like nothing that's ever been tried before. And it sounds like nothing could ever go wrong with this. And I guess it just sort of highlights one of the fundamental things that I always have as a problem with the left, is that it's this constant attempt to cut through the language bullshit. If you send somebody to a restricted area that is high security, and they're locked in, such that even though they, in full possession of their faculties, cannot willfully exit that place, then that place is a prison. Whether you call it a gulag, a prison, a camp, or a hospital, you are imprisoning that person. And if you force somebody while they're imprisoned to do labor for someone else's benefit and you do not compensate them, then you can call that community service. It is still forced labor. It's the same thing. You just found a different word to name that thing. And so half of the conversations with progressives are just them reconstructing the old system and then giving them credit for using the right words to describe their vision, with no indication that any of the problems that emerge from their vision of the world are actually going to be confronted, or it's not going to make them a lot worse. If anything, the loose and incorrect language is going to make these problems harder to see and harder to address. It's going to make it easier to hide the abuses than it would be in a system where we're actually saying the thing that we're doing explicitly. Okay, thank you for that $20. I love the name of this next person. A Catholic Critique of Catholic Culture for $10. You've talked about the need to engage with postmodernism instead of just bashing it like Jordan Peterson. One theological attempt you might consider is a Wikipedia link. I guess I'll click on this. Radical Orthodoxy. Well, I don't have time to read this Wikipedia article, but I'll certainly take a look at this. Postmodernism is, and always has been, in my opinion, fundamentally more consistent with reactionary ideas than it has been with left-wing ones. Gramsci, when he's imprisoned and he's writing his diaries, I don't know if that's really postmodern, but I consider this to be sort of the main departure from orthodox Marxism. He taps into, and what did my video just freeze here? Oh dear. Well, I'm going to continue going. Gramsci taps into while he's writing these prison diaries and while he's talking about cultural hegemony, he taps into something that is fundamentally more conservative and more right-wing than almost all Orthodox Marxism. He essentially reinvents Machiavelli, and he reinvents older authors. Okay, I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to see if I can switch to my alternative video camera, if you guys don't mind. Always so frustrating when this happens. That is a way worse picture, but I guess you get what you pay for. I didn't pay for this one, but maybe we can do this instead. All right, well, maybe I'll check back to see if I can get the better camera in place for the next part. But I said this before. This is, I talked to Matt McManus about this. Matt McManus, and this is what always kind of gets me about all of this postmodern conservatism stuff, or postmodern right-wing stuff. Postmodernism, to a large extent, was the left trying to come to terms with Nietzsche and Marx and Gramsci struggling Machiavellian ideas in the back door into Marxist theory. And because of this, what happened? Because of this, postmodernism, although it's created by leftists, has a genealogy that, in my opinion, is fundamentally right-wing. And so it's naturally at home there. It's naturally more at home there than it is on the left. And so, Matt McManus can complain all he wants about how regressive he thinks Joseph de Maistre is. Joseph de Maistre is saying many of the same things that Foucault is saying many of the same things that Gramsci is saying. And it's funny because these people, and Zizek says many of the same things too. Slavoj Zizek says a lot of the same things as well. And when you go to these people who are Marxists and leftists who are talking about postmodern ideas, they'll cite people like Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt, the ideas that Carl Schmitt was famous for, and I just finished reading Political Theology. It's that politics is equivalent at its fundamental level to the friend-enemy distinction. That's what it boils down to before any other ideology is introduced, and also that sovereignty is sort of fundamentally what governs the exceptions, and essentially frames all sorts the principles, the political principles like rights that we have. That these rights are not self-evident. They're not extensions of some kind of eternal principle that we're all tapped into. Rights are contingent upon some kind of sovereign order that's made a promise to you. And the way that you can tell what the sovereign order is that whenever the exception is made, you can see who's making the exception, and then that person is the controller of the sovereignty, right? And this dovetails very nicely with how our Supreme Court operates. Our Supreme Court is sovereign because it essentially tells us when and where our rights apply. And it's not exactly even clear where it couldn't make the exception. It made the exception in any number of ways. It made the exception in habeas corpus for Lincoln. It made a similar exception in Korematsu versus the United States government during World War II, during the internment of the Japanese. So Schmitt's right about this. But what I always want to ask leftists that cite Carl Schmitt is, I just don't understand how these fundamental ideas that Schmitt's bringing forward, and he literally cites people like Joseph de Maistre, how do you incorporate these ideas and not end up with a right-wing worldview? I mean, it seems that modern-day postmodernists have had to do a little bit of a dance to even get out of this problem. But anyway, I'll keep on going because, as usual, I've fallen into a rabbit hole. So let me pull up the... sorry here. Okay, here we go. The Wooster for $5. I saw your movie reviews and noticed your affinity for Southern Gothic. Have you read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian? Something tells me you'd like it. Yeah, it's one of my favorite books, The Wooster. Um, I absolutely will, and I guess I don't really want to be in the process of promising more stuff. I feel kind of bad. I promised a distributism series, and it's just been kind of eternally delayed because it keeps on getting bigger. I figure as long as I'm releasing videos, people probably won't mind too much. But this is Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and just Southern Gothic in general is just one of my favorite genres of all time. It's so rich, it's so American, and it communicates so much of what I think will last even after America exists, after the political unity of America kind of dissolves. There is sort of a fundamentally tragic and Gothic nature to the entire American project from its outset. And all truly great pieces of American art, I believe, have had this Gothic notion built into them. And what I feel in Southern Gothic is that this very, very American Gothic tendency is super highlighted. The South and Texas, which is not really the South, but kind of a weird intermediary between the South and the West, these places are sort of the most American places, and they have the most crude understanding of this fundamental American relationship with the Gothic tendency itself. And I'm just absolutely fascinated by this type of art, and I really want to talk more about it. This is a wonderful aesthetic, and it's not at all cozy. Let's just say, cozy is not the only aesthetic out there, and it's not. This is certainly not it. One thing that is absolutely cozy, and I want to also talk about this is sort of, if you go to American folk music, there is sort of a Gothic dimension to that in old time, but there's also sort of this charming, inoffensive, folksy rendition of it, where it's very, very sincerely genuine and positive. And that's always sort of the flip side to a lot of American art. And this is sort of the Americana that I see very, very well expressed in something like Prairie Home Companion. If you ever watch the comedian Joe Pera, his entire act is based on this notion. I don't know, a lot of bluegrass bands have this aesthetic to them. A lot of Coen Brothers movies have this kind of aesthetic to them, although they're very famous with mixing up this aesthetic with the Gothic aesthetic, which is why their rendition of Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men is just one of those eternal classics. But I think these two elements of Americana are constantly in tension with each other. The sort of comfy, sincere version of Americana, and then the deeper, darker, visceral, and bloody version. It lies somewhere in commonality, both with the indigenous European heritage of the continent, but also, strangely enough, the Aztec and Native American heritage of the continent. And it sort of haunts the place. I'm always reminded of the Burroughs novel Naked Lunch, where the author says, America was always haunted. It's the youngest country in the world, and yet it's haunted. Something evil was buried there before the Indians. And I'm butchering the line. I hardly remember it. But this is always what struck me about places in America, is they had some hidden darkness to them, even in places that had no right having that hidden darkness. That's always what fascinated me about David Lynch movies as well. The Lynchian notion just gets to the heart of the Americana feeling. Okay, thank you very much for your contribution. NPC Broadcasting for $5. I'm looking forward to the Doolittle Raz. About the latest performance on the 4th. That was the most depressing and blackpilling moment of the year. Yeah, but it was kind of funny though, because, I know everyone's going to comment on the sweaty nature of Doolittle after the event. People can comment on the source of that appearance, but it was really the speech before it that highlighted it. It's this guy, and he has a really uninspiring voice, and he's just screaming at the top of his lungs all of these quotes about taking back America and storming the gates, and everyone, all these old boomers with long rifles are just screaming reciprocality, and you just want to crawl under a rock whenever you see that. I don't know if it's still out there. I'm sure someone downloaded it. I'm sure someone made a mirror of that video. It obviously no longer is on John Mark's channel. He took it down. But it is very entertaining, I thought. I guess it's a little bit blackpilling. I don't know. In 2020, I certainly don't consider the collapse of propertarianism to be a blackpilling event. I don't know. It's too funny for me. I guess I probably should have more sympathy for people who got caught up into this whole thing during their initial, and it is really harmful whenever one of these leaders just completely collapses and self-destroy and just destroys themselves. There's a lot of schadenfreude that goes around on the right, but it's absolutely destructive. If you look at the last 4 years since I started my YouTube channel in 2016, if you look at the last 4 years of the right wing, do you know exactly how many channels have just destroyed themselves? They've just destroyed their reputations. And then ask yourself, how many left-wing channels have just imploded? And I think the honest answer is very, very few of them. And this is something that we just have to fix if we're going to do anything. If we're going to do anything in this as a movement to make things better for people. One more question, and then I'm going to get another drink and try to fix my camera. Jamie Weeby for $50 knock. Why do I think that's North Korean? But someone will have to correct me what it is. Oh, excuse me. I really enjoy your video essays. What advice do you have for people aspiring to write like you? Well, unfortunately, I don't consider myself much of a writer. What I've always struggled with is having flowery language. When I wrote a guide to writing on my old Discord channel, I wrote 2 pages on how to write something that sounds professional. And I'm so angry that when Discord deleted my server, they deleted that entire article. It's one of the reasons why I'm never coming back to that service in any serious capacity, is that I can't stand it when I lose things like that. I guess what I think makes a good essay is a sort of form and a sort of way of coming to a point. So in an essay, I always think you want to have a circle. An essay begins, and this is what they won't teach you in high school. In high school, they teach you the stupid way of writing an essay that's really easy to grade. You probably all heard it. It's the 5-paragraph essay form. I mean, I really hate this thing. It's terrible. It's impossible to read. So the 5-paragraph essay, for people who aren't American here, it's this idiotic way of writing an easy. I mean, it's not idiotic. It's how you want to. It's how you want to have your essay's skeletal structure to broadly mimic. But they teach you to write an essay where, in the introduction, you tell your audience exactly what you want to say, and you have a thesis statement that tells your audience what you're trying to prove, and then you have every paragraph you have a topic sentence, and then all the other sentences are supporting that topic sentence, which then supports in turn your thesis, and then the conclusion restates that thesis, and then you're done, right? And obviously people like this because it's easy. It's easy to do, right? It's easy to write a 5-paragraph essay, and more importantly, it's easy to grade a 5-paragraph essay. This is not how professional writers write articles. If you look at any article online, the form is much more different. What you always do, what it always starts with is a hook. The hook is like, this is a lead into what I'm talking about. And what hooks always have in common is that they are they're topical. They're about something that you experienced personally. They tell a story, a narrative that can draw your reader in, or they apply to something that everyone's kind of seen or is talking about, right? In YouTube, a classic hook is always to have like gossiping about another YouTuber. People love that. People love YouTube gossip on YouTube. For some reason, it's a classic way to do a hook. Or a story about something that happened to you in real life is another excellent hook. And then what you do is, at the end of this hook, you swing back to what you're actually going to talk about, the substance of your essay, right? And this is where you kind of do an introduction paragraph. But unlike your 5-paragraph essay, you don't give them your entire thesis. You kind of give them half of it. You tell them more or less what you're arguing for, but you don't tell them like the larger point, the larger meaning behind it, right? Like the ultimate conclusion. And then then you go through your arguments in a more systematic way, and in the end, that's when you kind of want to put your punch in, right? Not only do you get to your conclusion, you end with a bang, this is my point, boom, right? You also draw this into a larger feeling. Like you leave your audience with the understanding that you're not simply talking about the specific issue, but this raises more questions, higher issues that could be in the background. And this has always been the way I've approached expository writing. The most important thing in writing stuff that people will read is always the hook. And you'll never hear about it in any high school essay writing class or college writing essay class, but it's what everyone on the internet writes to produce. And as a matter of fact, many BuzzFeed articles, many clickbait articles, they're all hook and no substance. So you know, but I think having the circular idea is you come up with your thesis in the beginning, and then you go on a big journey, and then you circle back to it, and then when you circle back to it, your audience stands back and they get to see the big picture. That's the form that I like, and as much as I can say it in a live stream. So guys, I apologize, but I'm going to turn off the camera, change my drink, and try to see if I can't fix the video capture device. So I'll be taking a 5-minute intermission now. All right, so Sorry for that. But I was able to get my camera back, so that's good. So I guess I'll continue answering super chats. I will talk a little bit more about the sort of comfy, cozy aesthetic that I kind of alluded to in my video series. But I know that I've got, probably about an hour left, and I want to answer all of these super chats. And I think that kind of makes better content. I didn't really have that much of a spiel written for the cozy stuff. So, okay, so I just answered Jamie Weeby's advice on writing. So I hope that helps the advice. The Jim Jesus for $2 says, P Constitution and P Law. Yes. I guess we're all doing the P for propertarianism, like Kurt Doolittle, right? Yeah, I guess you could just refer to it as through its initials, right? P-tarianism, right? But thank you for that contribution for $2. I don't know how to really respond to that. No doubt you're referring to Doolittle's sweaty disposition after his very, very robust performance at Richmond. Okay, so continuing on. A No Quality Studio for $5. Reading Abolition of Man with friends and trying to be cozy. Any other trad book recommendations, religious or otherwise? Well, I believe, Abolition of Man was really one of the foundational books for myself in a return to religion. I can't disassociate that book from orthodoxy. The difficulty with recommendations, I find always, is that I don't know really where you're starting from. For instance, this is the classic book I always mention. A classic book that was, very important for a lot of people in their religious development was C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. This is, in my opinion, a very good book of apologetics, sort of an introduction to the Christian worldview. But it's terribly insulting to some people who are more bookish. It's written... It really feels like it's written more to a high school or young person level. And if you pass it off to someone who's just come from reading Schopenhauer, I think you might insult their intelligence. So it's always very, very hard to give general recommendations on reading material. Because of this, I don't really know where you're coming from. I think The Abolition of Man has the distinction of sort of being evergreen. I don't think there's a single person I can think of who's at all interested in ideas that wouldn't simultaneously understand Abolition of Man. And there's not a person in the world, I think, that would be insulted by its tone. I think the only other book I can think of like that, maybe a third one, would be G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy or Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue. Those are three very good general texts when it comes to discussing sort of the ethical worldview of virtue ethics or Christianity, and they're certainly my favorite. As for cozy, I had a very great reading group in many times in my life, and I'm very grateful for this. You can definitely do a cozy reading group with nonfiction. But I always associate being cozy with reading fiction. That's sort of part of the nightly ritual for me now is reading fiction. Speaking of cozy, I have my wife here who's next to me playing Skyrim. So, well, this is the family stream. Are you you're an archer in Skyrim?
I'm just started Skyrim for the 4th time. So I've lost about 200 hours of progress since my last game.
This is what I love about my wife. When she finds something that she likes, she sticks with it. Skyrim is the game, and it's never changed once, even though it came out in 2011. But so I guess, you know, I had an excellent reading group in college where we read things like Aristotle and Plato, and this was very much a reading group where you read the books ahead of time, and then you came to the thing, right? And then you discuss the books. That works really well with a very, very specific kind of person that actually does the reading. The difficulty is that these groups oftentimes have a tendency to fall apart. In my church in Seattle, another mode that worked really well was we're literally going to get together and read the books ourselves. This works excellent for Platonic dialogues. It works great for things like Abolition of Man and Orthodoxy. Short works. Because most of the people there were like grad students or young professionals. It's Friday, you're tired. You just want to get together and hang out and in a cozy room, drink beers, and read the book. You don't actually want to have to be accountable for having read it. So oftentimes don't necessarily dismiss. I know, like, reading things in a group together is sort of, it feels sort of juvenile to some people because it's what people did in grade school. But oftentimes it's more inviting to a lot of people, especially for shorter texts. Like, papal encyclicals are perfect for this. You just want to show up and you want to read a few chapters of this book and discuss the ideas. And it's only going to take you, 20 minutes in toto to read through the section, and you're going to divide up the reading, and then you're going to have a discussion. It works great for Bible discussion groups as well. So I don't know. Hopefully that advice works. The Wooster for $2. Will you endorse? Thank you very much, the Wooster. Will you endorse our guy Kanye for president? Well, I don't really vote for president because I'm in a state that doesn't that will never turn for anyone other than Biden, so it's really a complete waste of time. I don't have a problem with Kanye being president. He seems probably like he'd be better than the alternatives at this stage. He'd certainly be a change, and it certainly would throw a monkey wrench into the cathedral. So what the heck? Fine. I don't really care. Like I said, guys, this is what we want to maintain at all times when we talk about the presidency and presidential elections. We all know that at some point, Republicans are going to be completely unelectable and that the Democratic Party is going to control who wins the presidency. So I hope no one's planning for a life that's contingent upon the Democrats not being in power at the presidential level, because I think that's just setting yourself up for a very, very disappointing, not life, but a disappointing macrocosmic background to your life. But anyway, yeah, I will keep on going. Inactive Titan for $5. Imagine peeing yourself in public and single-handedly killing your movement. Well, yeah, I guess I'm not going to comment on Kurt Doolittle's appearance in that picture. It's not for me to say, but I can say that I've never seen someone sweat so distinctly. But at any rate, yeah, I want to emphasize this, though. I mean, though, really, I'll just reiterate what I said at the beginning of this talk. We have to learn Propertarianism self-destructing because Kurt Doolittle is cringe, and John Mark deleted his highly successful YouTube channel very mysteriously. That's almost a blessing. Could you imagine if they were competent? Like, imagine if they weren't completely cringe. The ideas Propertarianism puts forward of autistically kind of trying to double down on constitutional ideas, irrespective of the fact that there's no culture to support it. that's incredibly destructive. Their continuous talk about civil war that was going to get a lot of people in a lot of trouble at some point. And so in some sense, the fact that these people were completely cringe, I mean, it's almost a blessing, isn't it? Right? If they hadn't killed their movement that way, they probably would have done a lot more damage to the right wing cause generally. Nerve AMV Maker for $5. Someone mentioned McCarthy. You really should read his Border trilogy, specifically The Crossing. It's the great spiritual tragedy of modernity. So is the Border trilogy Blood Meridian, The Crossing, and No Country for Old Men? Because if that's the case, then The Crossing is the one that I haven't read. Which is, and I would actually want to reread Blood Meridian before I go on and read the other two, just so I have it fresh in my mind, because I'd want to kind of talk knowledgeably about all of them. Right now I'm trying to get through Moby Dick, so I'm probably not reading anything at the moment. But I felt like I talked a good deal about McCarthy. I wish I knew more about the guy. I think he's some kind of Christian, but he certainly has a very bleak perspective on the world. Anyone who writes No Country for Old Men and The Road, and that's not even their darkest novel, definitely has a bleak view of humanity generally. Aristocratic Owl for $10. Greetings, Dave. Do you have any advice for people who want to start producing reactionary content for the dissident right? Also, may the Lord guide you through life. Well, thank you very much for that blessing, Aristocratic Owl. Well, this is the problem with the reactionary content, is we're kind of getting canceled right now. I might just say go for it. Keep yourself anonymous and guard your private information very much, because this is what I've learned this year, is that just it's not enough to just meet somebody and think superficially, oh wow, this guy's not a psycho. Sometimes they turn out to be complete psychos and will dox people and try to get you fired because it makes them feel powerful, because it makes them feel big, because they get off on this idea of feeling powerful. And it's obvious at this stage that going after the right wing is not something that you'll ever have to answer for. Being a right-wing content creator, I think it's a risk, so obviously take care of your privacy. I would recommend, and I know that this is... pardon me, I'd recommend starting on YouTube. I think, well, I guess you could write a blog, but I think that, for years I wrote a blog and no one read it. And YouTube has a way of circulating much, much faster and getting the attention of people. And I do believe that a lot of people take notice of ideas that are proposed and discussed in video formats before they notice things that are long form and written. That being said, I would really, really, really like it if we could generate more long form written content. I think that would be great. I think that maybe you could write and then read it on YouTube. That would be absolutely amazing. I'd say, as far as content goes, I would say start by trying to address where the movement is now and not where it was in 2016. Where the movement is now is a movement that is disillusioned with Donald Trump, which is disillusioned with modern politics and modern electoral politics. And I don't care which side you come down on the questions, but don't try to pretend like this stuff hasn't happened or someone hasn't said anything before, right? So you can look at anti-SJW YouTube and you can comment on it and you can say, oh yeah, what they said here was right, and here's how we're going to update it. But you can't repeat what they said and just pretend like it's fresh, right? And So, and I know this is one of my writing advice tips that I had in that original document that I lost. One of the biggest problems for young writers, for writers or video makers who are starting out, is they start speaking in cliches. They say things that everyone knows other people have said, and they pretend like it's their own. And that kind of, in my opinion, and obviously there are anti-SJW channels like Bearing and Shoe on Head that have made bank out of doing just this. And so, far from me to criticize much more successful channels, but in my opinion, doing that insults the intelligence of your audience. If someone said something before and you know that they said it before, usually you say something like, so-and-so has said this and I agree with them, and here is my elaboration on what they've said. Or so-and-so has said this and I disagree with them, and here is why they're wrong. Present yourself as participating in a discussion that's as up-to-date as possible. Don't try to go in a time warp and repeat things that the conservative movement or even reactionaries from 3 years ago have been doing or have been saying. An excellent example of how to do this right would be Charlemagne's mulling over a Molebug series that he did, I think, the same year that I did my video on Mencius Molebug. He essentially reviews several key chapters from Mencius Molebug's Letter to an Open-Minded Progressive, which is sort of his seminal text. And he does this really good thing where he reads Mencius Molebug and he cites him, right? But he doesn't just leave it at that. What he tries to do is he tries to take an article that was written 10 years ago now, and he tries to update it and goes like, oh, this is where he was wrong, this is where he was right, this is where we see he was right now, this is how I might extend it. And if you look at Charlemagne's dealing with Molebug, I think you see a very, very good template about how, I think Charlemagne has a lot of good original ideas himself, but I think that video, that was a showcase of his excellent video making, but it wasn't really a showcase of his original ideas for obvious reasons. But it is a showcase how just as a pure commentator, you can make excellent content, highly productive content that brings the conversation forward in a really, really good way. And you don't necessarily have to like come up with some, blazingly original point. So I wanted to talk about, I think that's a great example. If maybe take a look at that if you're thinking of going onto YouTube. Excuse me. Doing yard work today. I'm very dehydrated, but at least we have the bearded dragon back. the prodigal Pagona. That's what bearded dragons are. Pagona. The prodigal Pagona is back again. Okay. I'm totally lost. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. $5 from the Ducat. Let's all be real at least. 50% of SJW versus alt-right stuff will be revealed in 2035 that they were FBI agents, doing it all for the lols. Well, I agree with you about a lot of the right-wing stuff. I think the right wing always has had a section of it that's glowed, using internet terminology. I don't like participating in it. I don't like calling it out because I think it contributes to a paranoid right-wing culture that hurts more than it helps. But we've known for a really long time that like an enormous number of like these I mean, I guess it's probably mainly the more violent organizations like, the KKK or whatever. They're almost like all federal agents. But I wouldn't be surprised if this carries over to online. Post Charlottesville, I wouldn't be surprised if an enormous number of these alt-right movements online are just FBI agents reporting on each other. I mean, it will certainly be very entertaining when all this stuff gets declassified, and we'll see what's what. But thank you very much, Duckett, for $5. I appreciate your contribution. Thank you very much. And you do have a very good point. So John Norman for $5. Sorry if I missed this. Have you read The True and Only Heaven by Christopher Lasch yet? I recommended by Deneen, reading it and loving it. Cheers. I have read Christopher Lasch, but it's been a very long time. Did he write the whole thing about narcissism and the narcissistic age? I believe that was him. He is an absolute gem of an author, but one that I am a little bit far away from reading. I do remember that he's definitely one of the sources that Patrick Deneen cited. I think you meant Deneen. I think he wrote something else, but he's definitely one of the sources cited in Why Liberalism Failed. And I should reread him again. I have not read The True and Only Heaven. That sounds like an interesting read. My reading list is so long, though. I got to get through Moby Dick, though. At least as far as nonfiction. Die Hard Doogie for $10. I would love to do a stream with you that dispels right-wing myths of military victories. Yeah, that would be really good. That sounds amazing. I'd love to collaborate with you about a video about that. That would be amazing. I think this is the right wing, and this is sort of augmented by a lot of myths about the Revolutionary War, that this ragtag group of rebels can eke out a victory against this bigger empire represented in the British. Left out of the equation is the fact that the American Revolution essentially had a huge group of allies, both in Parliament and also in a foreign power that was the French Navy. And without those two forces, the revolution almost certainly would have been crushed. But this is something that we just have to put aside these sort of Fed posty ideas. Red America does not have the ability to impose its will upon Blue America. That's not something that they have currently. Their coalition is not powerful enough. And but thank you very much for the contribution. I can't think of how I can really riff on that currently, so I'm just gonna go on down the line. Thank you very much again. Your contributions are always really generous, diehards. So I hope to see you in the future. And I really would like to talk with you more about doing a stream like that. I am not the person to interview you. I almost feel that Charlemagne would be a better person to have that conversation with, since he's the person who's really into the military history thing, I believe. Or maybe even Fritz Imperial. Although, I don't know. It's been a while since Fritz has interviewed anybody, but I would give him some pointers on doing interviews in the future. I think he could tighten his game up a little bit. Athemius for $33. Thank you very much. Why is the silent majority silent? If the proportion of costs are too high for public dissent, where is the bridge too far? How do we square boiling frogs with absolute record firearm sales? God bless you and your family. The silent majority is silent because the silent majority doesn't have any power. The proportional costs are too high for public dissent because the progressive side of the equation has spent the last 40 years building their ideas about civil rights into the required dialogue that needs to go on at all times, and that's agreed upon by human resource departments, which almost all companies have to have, because if they do not have a civil rights, if they do not have, slip of the tongue, Freudian slip there, if they do not have a human resources department, then they can be sued for civil rights violations very, very easily, because there will be people who will claim that disproportional representation in their corporation is an indication of a hostile working environment for picker protected group, minorities, women, etc. And if there's not an HR department that's there to show them that they're following all of the best HR practices, that prima facie case can be quite deadly, especially to a company that does not have a bunch of liquid capital. Companies are aware of this, and that is essentially what gives the progressive side an enormous amount of power in the modern world. Not to mention their complete domination of entertainment and information media. How do you fight that organization? It's not even boiling a frog anymore. The trap is triggered. The trap is set. You can get fired for many right-wing ideas. You can get fired for misgendering people in my state at this stage. I guess maybe I believe this is actually an extension of it, and I do believe that someone has gotten fired for this. Although now I need to check my facts on this. But it is a natural extension of what the HR departments teach inside their training, right? They teach that properly gendering somebody is a part of respecting their civil rights. Therefore, by contrast, not using pronouns is a violation of civil rights. And having a manager or having an employee that's not disciplined for the violation of another employee's civil rights is the grounds for a lawsuit. So, what is the HR department going to be doing? People can buy guns. There's no consequence to buying guns. But speaking out, there are social consequences for doing that. And in order to speak out in a way that actually matters, you need to have media. You need to have organization. And where are people going to do that? No one's answered that question. No one's answered the question of how we are going to organize these people. Do they have new ideas and things to say and things to contribute? If the silent majority is just angry and they're just silent, then they're fundamentally not participating in politics in any meaningful way. They can own, 5 rifles, but that's not going to translate into political power. Not outside of some incredibly unusual circumstances where there's some kind of dissolution of political order, but not to the extent that the military is actually brought in. Okay, hopefully it answers that question. Thank you for the blessings. The silent majority is silent because power has voice, and the people who are silent don't have power. The idea that you have a voice by virtue of you just being a citizen is unfortunately one of the many myths of the Enlightenment. I don't think it was ever true, and I think you can see it manifested in the last 20 years of politics. Anarch Bombadil for £2. Have you ever read Michael Houellebecq? Serotonin is dank AF. I don't know if I have. I do want to read Submission. That's on my reading list, is to read Submission, which is sort of, I feel like that's the Michael Houellebecq novel. It's Welbeck, isn't it? It's Welbeck. Although I know I said this before. If you're a new vlogger and you're a woman and you want to get into the reactionary sphere, could someone please take the name Welbeck girl to do like a Gwen Stefani Houellebecq girl call out? I think that would be super funny. I'll check out Serotonin. A lot of people have been recommending Welbeck to me, and it's just it's just time. It's just time. I haven't had the time to do it. I haven't had time to read that. The Wooster for $10. Amazingly put, America is haunted. The South and Mexico openly embrace this tragic sense, but it's slipping to the consciousness of the country rapidly. Here's another donation. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, this is something I mentioned in my movie review video that I uploaded on my channel. And I did so terribly that I decided to move it to my wife's channel, but I don't think I've actually uploaded those yet to her channel. My favorite explorer of the hauntedness of America has to be David Lynch. This idea of the Lynchian reality is something that is so thoroughly the reality we live in. This is something that David Foster Wallace talked a lot about in several of his interviews he gave before he killed himself very tragically. Was this idea of the Lynchian. In the Lynchian is this idea that you juxtapose the wholesome, and that's the other notion of American aesthetic, right? Like the genuine, wholesome, quaint kind of aesthetic, and you juxtapose that with something that's like dark and nefarious, and somehow diseased, right? And so, like, a classic example of a Lynchian moment would be like, a guy murders his wife, and he murders her because she got the wrong brand of milk, and then like why the cop I think this is the very example that David Foster Wallace used in his interview, and while he's getting arrested, the cops like complain, they commiserate about like, oh, how important it is to get brand X of milk, and oh, it's too bad, it's tragic, now we have to arrest you. That kind of gets this ridiculous, quaint notion of suburban America where buying the right brand of milk is some kind of big deal, and it juxtaposes it with murder and for comedic effect. That's one classic way of doing the Lynchian inversion. The other way, and this is one way that I appreciate, in all Lynchian movies you have these two dimensions, and that's why all Lynchian movies have both a comedic dimension and also a scary dimension. So the comedic dimension is what I just said, where you've got like the serious super text, and then behind it you've got the trivial subtext, the brand of milk being wrong, and that's the reason why this murder occurred, and it's somehow the police that are arresting this guy understand it. It's a ridiculous serial perspective, right? The one that I kind of like more is where David Lynch does the other thing, where he has like this wholesome exterior, right? Like the super text is wholesome, but something like dark is going on behind it. A great example of this is one of my favorite scenes from Mulholland Drive, where two people are in this like super cheesy 1950s diner in Southern California. And if you've ever been to Southern California, every one of the super cheesy diners feels like this diner. It's obviously supposed to invoke like Michigan in the 50s, but it's obviously in Southern California. And they're discussing this dream, and I don't dare ruin this scene for you, and I just recommend watching Mulholland Drive from the beginning. But while you're hearing them discuss this dream in this kind of very, very wholesome environment that's super cheesy, you have this ominous feeling that something terrible is happening in the background. Like it's nightmarish. Like this dread is building. This dread is building behind you. And there's many other examples of this. Suburban people are talking in their homes, and there's this ominous music, and you feel like something terrible is happening, and they just won't admit it. Just out with it. Come out with it. What's wrong? And so, and I really love how David Lynch does that, and I really feel it kind of captures that. But thank you for the contribution. Justin Bentley for $5. Tacoma boy here. I guess that's you're from Tacoma. Well, thanks. I never lived in Tacoma. Obviously, I lived for a long time in Seattle. But it's a nice town. It's fallen on hard economic times for sure. But I always felt like it was very well situated. I always have good memories of the times that I visited it, which have been few and far between. But thank you very much for the contribution. David graft for $10. Will corporations eventually push aside the current ruling class as they gain more and more power over people's lives? E.g., what's stopping Wizards of the Coast from building a country of MT Magic the Gathering? Okay, so will corporations eventually push aside the current ruling class as they gain more and more control over people's lives? What's stopping Wizards of the Coast from building a country of Magic the Gathering consumers? Well, I mean, in some sense, that's what's happening, right? The reason why we're not in, I think, like Neuromancer or Netrunner area. You know, if you're ever a Neuromancer, it's this depiction of a future world totally dominated by mega corporations. The reason why we're not in that place right now is that the corporations understand they have a symbiotic relationship with the government. And they in some sense do not want to wield sovereignty, because a corporation is accountable. That's what it does very, very well, is become accountable. And what gives the present ruling order so much power is that it's unaccountable. This is something that Mencius Moldbug points out a lot, and I think this is sometimes missed, though, right? What's oftentimes missed in Moldbug's writing is that if Apple were to take over California or take over the United States, you would know that every decision made by anyone in the government would be immediately traceable to the CEO of Apple. He could not claim that that's somehow outside of his power or outside of his responsibility to answer for. And when you think about it, that's sort of the exact opposite way of how our present government operates. Just look at Seattle and Portland. Completely, like, I bet people in other countries are flabbergasted by this. So you have rioters that are communists and Marxists and anarchists, and they're attacking the federal government. And in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, a large number of the municipal body of these cities is, if not cooperating with these quote-unquote protesters, they're turning a blind eye to them. They're letting the protests proceed because the mayors are trying to foment conflict between the federal government and these protesters. They're trying to elicit a bad response from Trump. This is insane. Who's responsible for these cities? Anybody who wields force inside Seattle, the buck should stop with the mayor, Mayor Durkham, right? That's where the buck stops. Anyone exerting force against federal officers is an extension of her will. And to the extent that she's lost control of Seattle, that means that she's a bad mayor, she's an incompetent at her job, and frankly, any other system, if this happened inside a corporation, the executive above her would immediately remove her from office. But the way our current government works is that everyone constantly gives up their sovereignty. They want to wield power, but only to the extent that they can benefit from it. And to the extent that the power would hold them accountable in some way that they don't want to be, e.g. controlling their police force, right? That the mayors in Seattle and Minneapolis and Portland, they want to have police, but they do not want to answer for why their officers arrest and shoot more black people than white people. And so how do you avoid this? Well, you foment a huge conflict between the federal government and the protesters. You essentially surrender your sovereignty to avoid blame. And this is the element of the cathedral that absolutely drives people like myself and Curtis Yarvin up the wall. And it's something that would never occur inside a corporation. And it's something that in many ways is highly lucrative for them, because in many ways, so many aspects of the federal government bureaucracy are hidden. It's not clear how they actually work. It's not clear who actually has sovereignty in these situations. And that works to the benefit of global corporations, and they understand this. If Apple took over the United States, or if Wizards of the Coast took over the United States, And our immigration policy was essentially open borders, which it's not right now, but it's kind of getting close. It would be immediately apparent that the Apple CEO wanted to have open borders, and he was the one directly responsible for that decision, because the buck ended there. And that would be the conclusion if it were a corporate policy, wouldn't it? It's what a jury would decide if he got sued for one of his decisions. But of course, that formalism isn't there, right? And so we're kind of left in limbo, which is exactly what the corporations want, right? That's exactly how they thrive. So I would say that the reason why the corporations haven't taken over Neuromancer style is that they, like the mayors of these municipalities like Portland and Seattle, understand the utility of plausible deniability, and they understand the utility of partially surrendering sovereignty that they might otherwise seize. If they surrender their sovereignty to another body, or they skirt their responsibilities, they can, in essence, escape blame for a system that they fundamentally benefit from. And that is what essentially is controlling our global order, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Will corporations eventually push aside the current ruling class as they gain more and more power over people's lives? What's stopping... Wait, I just read that one. Oh my god, I'm just getting tired. But the show must go on. Ella Menno. That's exactly how I pronounce the sequence of the alphabet when you're singing the ABC song. But Ella Menno, not P, says, do you think the Dark Ages were dark? Why or why not? So this is a question that I find kind of frustrating. I find it frustrating. Well, okay. So hold on, let me load my thoughts here. This is a question I find frustrating because this is such an easy thing to solve, right? It's so easy, and I feel like there's such easy ways to divide up history. It's the stupid way we divided up history in the past, and I think we just need to change it. So how historians classically divided this period was that there was the fall of the Western Roman Empire in around 400 AD, and then there was the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1400, roughly 1453, right, the 15th century, right, and between the 5th century and the 15th century, there was this 1,000-year period called the medieval/Dark Ages. And that is the middle period in between when the Western Roman Empire fell and when the Eastern Roman Empire fell. And I guess because they like the dates, this was all very, very, nice and tidy. It's a complete misrepresentation of how human society progressed. The Middle Ages/Dark Ages can be very, very definitively broken up into two sections. The first section occurs from 400 to 1000 AD, and this is when Catholicism and Christianity have not yet conquered Western Europe. And what characterizes this era, and in many ways Rome hasn't completely fallen yet either, what characterizes this era is a mad dash to conquer Europe. And obviously, during this time, the Moors take over Spain, and Islam comes into effect in some areas, not in really Europe other than Spain. But there's the Vikings, there's the Magyars, the tail end of the Lombard invasions. This period between 400 and 1000 is absolutely dark. It's a period of very, very low technological advancement. Some evidence of technologies being lost. It's an extension of the fall of the Roman Empire. But in many ways, it's just a mad dash to consolidate power. However, post-1000 AD, which are usually considered the beginning of the High Middle Ages, this is the point where, round about 1000 AD, The Vikings start becoming Christianized. The Magyars are defeated. The German-speaking Holy Roman Empire is established. The beginning of the Reconquista starts taking root in Spain. This is when the Catholic Church has conquered Europe and there is basically one religion. And from that point forward, from 1000 AD forward, it's an unparalleled advancement in human learning that flowers into the Renaissance and that later flowers into the scientific revolution. I would say that the Renaissance basically starts there. That's how you get all the famous theologians come from that period. Thomas Aquinas is obviously the 13th century. All these great works of fiction and poetry. And when you try to think of something that's in the period of 400 to 1000, I mean, I can think of one, Boethius, right? It's obviously a low point. Now, I guess you could call 1000 and after, you could call that the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, and then the stuff before the Middle Ages or Dark Ages. But I think it's sort of deceptive. Most of our understanding of the Middle Ages, like the Crusades and knights in shining armor and everyone being Catholic and all this stuff, all of the imagistics we have of the Middle Ages comes from the culture post 1000 AD. Very little of it comes from like the Merovingians or the Carolingians. It's very, very hard to imagine a Merovingian. And because of that, because the imagistics are so vague, right? So because of that, I would say the Middle Ages, if we're talking about post 1000, Middle Ages were certainly not dark. 400 to 1000 AD, when Europe was fighting between paganism and barbarians and Catholics and various different heresies over who would rule Western Europe. Yes, that period of chaos, that period of total chaos was definitely dark, and it was definitely very, very bloody, and I would never want to live in that period of time. So a very long answer. I just think this continuous confusion is a problem with how we've divided up the time periods. A problem with how people in the Enlightenment, like what's that guy's name? The guy that wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Oh, I'm drawing a blank, but you know who I'm talking about, right? It's how they divide up history that's been the problem. Muse the Reaper for £5. Just wanted to say that I found your content really refreshing, particularly your 3-part series. Do you have any book recommendations? Well, last time when someone asked me this question, I said you should read something from Stanislaw Lem or Dostoevsky, particularly the Brothers Karamazov. So I can't say those books again, I feel like. Again, I have no idea where you're coming from. I don't know. I think a book that I've enjoyed. I'm really enjoying Moby Dick right now. I'll say that. I've always enjoyed science fiction, so perhaps I could recommend another science fiction book that I read recently, or another series of science fiction books for people who are. Now this is a good one. Okay, I'll recommend this. Gene Wolfe's The New Sun trilogy. This is an excellent. And and you have to go into this with the right mood, okay? And really, you have to be the right person for this. But if you're a person who likes Gothic fiction, right, and in particular, if you're interested in that cultural notion of Gothicness that kind of exists inside David Lynch movies and Southern Gothic. And in the early part of the Middle Ages, and perhaps, we don't really know, perhaps the Dark Ages, perhaps the 400 to 1000 AD period, if you're interested in that feeling, I really, really love Gene Wolfe's The New Sun series because it captures that very middle-aged feeling and it transports it into some distant future time that's so futuristically advanced we have a very, very hard time understanding it, right? And it's wonderfully imaginative, but it's not for everyone. It uses a very, very common Gothic motif where the protagonist himself is insane. This is what Flannery O'Connor did in her excellent novel Wise Blood, where you have a protagonist that's insane, and it seems like everyone else is insane too, and they're somehow navigating this crazy world. And it's a wonderfully evocative book, and I'd recommend it for fiction. As for nonfiction, I don't know. I'd recommend rereading The Prince, or the Machiavellians by Burnham. That was a great one too. So I don't know. Take those book recommendations if you can. Maybe I'll do an entire stream on book recommendations. Oh, here's another recommendation. I was considering doing my next distance on just the Devil's Dictionary. So the Devil's Dictionary is this wonderful, I won't call it poetry. It's this wonderful joke dictionary written by Ambrose Bierce. And it's a spoof on Dr. Samuel Johnson. So Dr. Samuel Johnson was a famous conservative from the 18th century. It was either the early 18th century or the late 17th century. Inventor or first writer of the English dictionary, and a wonderful man of letters. And he was very well known for his wit. And very famously in the original dictionary, he lapses from providing meaningful definitions of words, just giving his plain old opinion on matters. So very famously, he defines patron as a rich man who's paid in false promises and returns and pays forth in ingratitude, or something to that effect, right? It's basically like, reading his definition of patron is basically him bitching about his own attitude towards the ungratefulness of his own patrons at the time. And so Ambrose Bierce did sort of a spoof on these Johnsonian definitions, and wrote an entire book comprised entirely of joke definitions that were supposed to reflect the most cynical, like, not the definition of the word, but really what we actually mean when we say it, if we think that human beings are represented by their worst possible natures. And so it's a wonderful little book, and one that has a lot of political lessons that I think you can draw out of it. And I was thinking of doing a live stream where I just read through my favorite definitions from the Devil's Dictionary, and we can talk about what is meant by them. One, I'll give you an example of the Devil's Dictionary in sort of a Johnsonian inversion. His definition of alliance is, in international politics, a union where two thieves have each other's hands so deeply inserted in each other's pockets that they cannot separately be used to plunder a third. So that's sort of like the clever definition of alliance in the words of the Devil's Dictionary. But I think it would be fun to do that in a future live stream. I'm going to keep on scrolling. This is weird. Coming to the end of this. First time I've caught your show live. A lot of your content is over my head, to be honest, but I still enjoy it. Keep it up. Well, this is by Ed Lundgren for $5. Thank you very much. Well, I always appreciate the contributions. Thanks a lot. I'm wondering why I can't scroll down farther than this. Anyway, okay, there we go. This is the last one before. Yeah, so Ed Lundgren. So thank you very much. I feel like people really enjoy the live streams, and I want to do more of them. I always feel that they're sort of substandard content, but I enjoy doing them, and sometimes I'm really tired. Like today, I'm really tired, and so my voice is just going. You can probably hear it right now. It's just giving out. So I probably will have to end this at midnight here. So thank you for your patience. I will try to say a few more words, but I guess maybe people can zip up the super chats, and I'll try to do a longer live stream next time when I'm not so exhausted from the day's work. But you know how these things go. It's always it's always gonna be late. It's always gonna be after the baby goes to bed. While I'm watching my wife play Skyrim, I can never get over the Bethesda oblique. Let me do the Skyrim in Skyrim when you talk to people, they always go like, "Hello, I am a Bethesda humanoid, and I want to talk to you about something." Isn't it always weird? They never have any angle to how they speak into the. I don't know. You don't notice that? Isn't this a Bethesda game?
Yes, it is.
I thought that was a thing. That's a thing,
I have
right?
a hard time understanding your beef, I guess.
They look like mannequins when you talk to them. They look less real when you talk to them than when they're just wandering around their world. And
Yeah.
I mean, so you press talk to the person and suddenly you're thrown into the uncanny valley.
Look, I'll show you.
Okay. Well, I probably should get back to the live stream,
Okay.
but the people can't. Okay, I gotta preserve my voice here. Okay, Anarch Bombadil for £2. Chaz has not even been mentioned once in our papers. Well, I assume you're in Britain or in England or somewhere in the UK since you're paying me in pounds. Although I don't think that's a requirement. Oh, excuse me. But I think, you hardly hear about Chaz in California or in Oregon or anywhere. It's people have completely forgotten about it, and it's insane, isn't it? The mayor essentially cooperated with an armed militia who took over 3 prime real estate blocks of Seattle and murdered a bunch of people. And this was done with the mayor's tacit approval. And then when people called her out on it, she chastised Fox News for being fake and trying to blow up a street fair into something it wasn't. I've been to street fairs in Capitol Hill, and they don't typically feature people walking around with rifles. They don't have massive crime going on there, or at least they didn't. They don't have a complete decline in law and order and people destroying private property. That's not usually how street fairs work in rich modern cities. Yet somehow the municipal government completely cooperated with an anarchist takeover of a hugely expensive piece of real estate. I don't know what to say. It's such a dereliction of what we would ordinarily consider the duty of an elected official who is an executive. To willingly stand down law and order in a section of your city so that you can make a larger political point, either for re-election, because she's got that crazy Savant woman who's after her job, or to try to help the Democrats out in November because you're hoping that, the federal troops get called in and that Trump will have a bad photo up on his hands. Okay. Justin Bentley with a very good question, but one that I'm going to have a hard time answering in the completeness it deserves for $5. What are your thoughts on Stoicism? Stoicism is a philosophy that has very little wrong with it. However, that being said, so Stoicism is the ancient Greek philosophy. about sort of cultivating this serene and perfected inner moral self. Usually it's associated with people who hide their emotions and try to suppress destructive emotions, kind of like Mr. Spock, although the philosophy is much deeper than just trying to be like Mr. Spock. Certainly the most popular Stoic text was one that I very much enjoyed, more or less in my atheist phase, the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And if you want to get an overview, Marcus Aurelius was one of the last good Roman emperors, one of the last good military dictators, before things started really going downhill. But he was also a writer, and he wrote these meditations down, and he was certainly not one of the founders of Stoicism. Obviously, it was much, much older, and it was Greek, not Roman. But I think that his meditations are a good intro. The problem with Stoicism is that it lacks a lot. It has the same problem of Buddhism, is that it admits it's almost sort of the spiritual equivalent of the Sargon of Akkad individualism, where it's so focused on a very necessary question of ethics, it leaves out of question man's larger relationship to higher metaphysical reality. So it completely skirts around the question. I mean, most Stoicism has believed in a God, very vaguely defined, but it skirts around all sorts of theological questions. And moreover, it skirts around larger collective political questions that are very, very important to answer. And so what you end up with Stoicism is you have a religion, and most people who practice Stoicism responsibly realize that what they're doing is a religion. But you have a religion that's kind of hollowed out in a lot of ways, right? It has a lot of good stuff in there, absolutely. Like, Buddhism has some great meditation tips, and it has some great tips on how you should be in the moment, and it's a very good to remember. But at the same time, it leaves so much rich and important things out. It leaves an entire notion of how we should be more outwardly focused out of question. It leaves the entire question of collective political politics out of the question. And so always when dealing with Stoicism, you're dealing with this religion that naturally invites you to cut off natural elements of theology and politics and just kind of retreat into this self-focused and even self-improvement focused. Even self-improvement mindsets can be kind of selfish to a certain extent. True political postures and political ethics have to be outwardly focused and collective in nature, and they have to have an understanding of aesthetics and an understanding of right and wrong that has a language that it can extend and impose itself upon collectives and not simply individuals. And any true religion has to have an understanding of teleology and an understanding of theology that exists first and foremost outside of man's own soul. God cannot simply exist on the interior of man's soul. And if he does, I think you're going to end up with a lot of people that either look like, individualists of the liberal variety or individualists of the modern progressive urbanite variety, where they're completely focused on working hard and eating right, and they've completely let their society go to pot, as far as I'm concerned. There are a lot of very capable people in Silicon Valley. There are a lot of very capable people in San Francisco. There's probably more capable people in San Francisco than there ever have been collected in one given place at any time. But they're all focused on selfish political priorities, and they don't have the motivation to see outside of themselves that the system that they're proposing for the rest of the world isn't working for anybody. and I have this creeping suspicion that what they're doing, the philosophy that they have harpened on, which we've discussed this before in other live streams, which is in essence a sort of Christian heresy where you get rid of God and keep Christian ethics. Getting rid of God and keeping Christian ethics looks a lot like what Stoicism is, kind of. It's sort of this sort of Gnostic Stoic notion, right? And in many ways, that's a huge problem. I mean, who wants to have an elite that's totally disinvested from the civilization that produced them? And that's essentially what we have now, right? And I don't know what to do with these people in a lot of ways. I don't know how they want me to react to them, to be quite honest. Anyway, I'll try to answer some more questions. I'm sorry. Totally lost. I'm rapidly. My mind's rapidly going. But that's my thoughts on Stoicism. It's the path of Stoicism. I think is going to leave you with elites that look a lot like, the grammarians or our modern day elites in San Francisco. People who are inwardly focused with no investment in larger theology or larger society. The Wooster for $5. What would you say to someone who's interested in Catholicism but is turned off by the Pope and some of the Church's doctrine, asking for a friend? Well, the first and most important thing is to determine whether you're a Christian. Determine whether that is a path you're going down. And if that's the path you're going down, the next question is, I guess, do you believe in apostolic succession, or that there is an apostolic church? And if you do, then there's got to be a head of that church. And then it's really a question of authority. That succession could be the Orthodox Church. That succession could be the Catholic Church. That succession could be one of the schismatic Catholic sects, like SSPX. But it seems like it would have to be one of them. And so if you're a Christian and if you're an apostolic Christian, I think you're left with trying to evaluate their historical claims. And that's not something that I'm qualified to answer in Super Chat. But it's something that I think that's the proper way to ask the question. I definitely don't think you should be using the current Pope as a measurement of that question of papal authority to be the vicar of Christ, at least insofar as he has not. I mean, obviously, if the Pope teaches error or the Pope contradicts doctrine, then that absolutely would bear on the claim. But just being, kind of an incompetent Pope does not, in my opinion, bear on that question. So there's that. But more than even that question, absolutely positively do not allow current church politics to govern over the deeper question over whether Christ's claims are true or whether you believe in God. Those questions need to be answered in a broader spiritual context, and they have to be answered, I think, independently from poor behavior of Christians. I know that sounds, I guess in some sense they can't entirely be answered independently from Christians, because there's always that invocation that by your fruits you shall know them. We have to sort of bear witness as Christians in a better way than we've been doing. But I really don't like the idea that for temporal political reasons you turn away from what was a true spirituality. I think that's doing a bad thing. That's putting something that's ugly ahead of something that's more important and more beautiful. you know, it would be like a person who put their online career ahead of their family, right? Like that. It just you want to treat your relationship with God as primary, and your relationship with politics as secondary. Okay, I think this is the last super chat I'll answer because I'm completely out of energy, and I'll have to answer the questions about coziness or the extended thing about coziness some other day because I just don't have the energy to keep on going. But thank you so much for the super chats. I really appreciate it. So the last super chat here is Corpse Carter for $10. Would you do a trad codex on dark fantasy and grim dungeon stories, i.e. Dark Souls, Darkest Dungeon, Berserk, and Doom? One of those things is not like the other. Doom is science fiction, right? I feel they are the answer to New Sincerity. God bless. I do have a trad codex that's planned on Conan the Barbarian and Lord of the Rings. I think I should just try to take this and fit it in there. I guess the question is, and maybe you can answer this in a follow-up @reply, is just pardon me, I brushed the mic there. These newer brands I'm not super aware of, right? I never played Dark Souls. I don't really play video games. I know my brother really likes Darkest Dungeon. But I really would like to read Berserk and see if that's something that I would want to incorporate in this. It might be something that's interesting. I think pulp might be a way to address this. I'd have to... What you're essentially saying is that I should look into modern dark fantasy. I feel like I'm very familiar with classical dark fantasy. But modern dark fantasy is something that I think you're right, absolutely there. I should try to put some investment into looking. People have been recommending Berserk to me for the longest time, but I don't know. I see it in the stores, and it's a graphic novel, and it's like in plastic. Why would you ever buy a book that's encased in plastic so you can't read it before you buy it? They do this with, I don't know. I guess if anyone wants to recommend to me in the last 5 minutes what, if there's any non-video game example of this in the modern world that I could look into for my eventual trad codex on my eventual trad codex on Lord of the Rings and Conan, I'd be really interested. Again, I don't. It's been kind of a genre that I think has been neglected in the modern world. I don't doubt that it exists in video games, but I really feel that things have to exist in forms that are more easy to share, right? I do respect video games, but I'll have to take a look. Obviously, fantasy has always had a hard time with New Sincerity because of the fact that it's detached from realism. And I guess, this is something that I said, and maybe I'll end on this little speech here or little talk is, in order for New Sincerity to work, I feel like it has to incorporate an element of realism into it. And of all of the artistic approaches, I feel that realism is the one that is the most right-wing. If there's anything that the right wing has to offer, it is an honest statement about the nature of the human soul and about the human as a political creature. So if the answer to New Sincerity exists in some form that's fantastical, it's got to be in some fantastic form that goes to the heart of addressing real human questions, and that isn't just some kind of exercise in fantasy or world building. I'll list an example of a world I really like, Warhammer 40K. I never played the game really, but this is I love the world. I love the images. I love the pictures. I love the factions. I love how dark it is, how like pseudo Catholic it is. It's great. It's delicious, delicious, delicious. But the art that exists around Warhammer 40k, it's 100% fantasy crap. It doesn't get to the heart of a real human experience or a real human question. And you know, and I know I've tried to read the fiction, and it's just not of a very high quality. And so I'm kind of I kind of always struggle with it. I feel in many ways Gene Wolfe gets a lot closer. Gene Wolfe's world is not very much fun. I'll say his books are very, very hard to read, if I'm being honest, because of the unreliable narrator. But I believe he does try to tackle a human question more directly, and he does try to tackle these elements of realism. These elements like, okay, you know, this is a fantastic world, but I have real human issues playing out inside of them. And this is what all good literature does, and it's what, you know, in particular realism, like Middlemarch, George Eliot, or Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky. It's what these great authors of the 19th century were able to do too, to draw out some real human drama from that. And this is sort of the essence. I think this is one of the ways that, and I know I haven't talked very much about coziness and how it's an answer to ghost dancing, and that's going to have to wait for another stream because I'm much too tired to talk about it now. But one of the ways I hope is that we can use this notion of realism to get back and to address sincere human moments. And then this is a basis for something that's not autistic. That's not just focused on systems. That's not focused on fantasies. And that's not focused on just doubling down on things that have worked in the past and really, frankly, ignoring the world we have in front of us. I think that there's going to be a pivotal moment after we come out of quarantine. You know, a lot of the questions people ask me in these things, especially the ones about what we can do, and what we can do politically, how we can organize. I feel like we're going to have the answer to these questions after November. After November, I feel pretty sure that we're going to be winding down the lockdowns. We're going to have to at some stage, right? And we're also going to know if Biden or Trump won. And I think a new America is going to emerge in November. That's going to be different from a lot of the assumptions we've been making about this collectivity in the past. And we're going to have to reevaluate a lot of things. We're going to have to take our values and we're going to have to figure out how we're going to achieve those values post this epochal change. And I think inside of that, that's sort of going to be gating a lot of these questions, a lot of the honest answers about how we're going to deal with these things. I can see everyone on the dissident right's kind of saying the same thing right now. Like Nick Fuentes is saying the same thing. Like, we don't have a lot of options right now. I don't think that this is going to be a very, very long standing state of affairs. I think that what's going to happen is that the cathedral is going to essentially declare a new normal, and then we're going to have to react to that in whatever capacity we can. But inside all of that, inside all of this entire process, I truly believe that the right has to be laser focused at all times at building these cozy spaces, these cozy and sincere experiences where people can go and actually learn something true spiritually and perhaps improve themselves. We don't know what's going to come after this particular political moment we occupy right now, but we know what's good. We have an understanding of what's healthy. And if we pursue that, I think that we'll be doing the right thing, and we'll be laying the groundwork for whatever comes next. I think that once things gel again, the way forward is going to be clear. And we might have to come to terms with some losses. I think we definitely will. We'll have to come to terms with, in many ways, this country not belonging to us in a very radical way. but things will also be more clear. The relationship with power will be clarified in a very radical way. And in there's the opportunity to build something. And I think that our focus should always be that this thing that we build is something that's worthy of lasting. And that's really the essence of Cozy. So with that, I am completely exhausted. Thank you very much for being a great audience for me, even though my energy levels were not quite the way they usually are during these things. And I hope you have a wonderful next rest of the week. I think there'll be some video releases. I'm not so happy with these next videos, but in YouTube you have to release your mistakes. But hopefully I'll be doing another Distance series soon, and maybe even I'll create a channel to do these things more regularly. We'll do them shorter and in more regular times. But at any rate, have a blessed week and stay safe with yourself and your family. Good evening.